Welcome in 365 Sports. Paul Kedley alongside Kenneth Davis, Big Ten country with us. And before we get to that, Kenneth, that first Bears game was not exciting offensively at all, but they were gritty and hung in and won the game the only way they could have won the game. If the offense ever gets clicking, they might be a lot better than we might even thought.
Yeah, and I think the question is how long is it going to take for the offense to get to clicking? It may be a roller coaster ride. I think it could be 1 week where it's functioning properly. Caleb and the wide receivers really weren't synced up, particularly him and Keenan Allen. The Bears traded for Keenan Allen, of course, for everybody that knows that. But, I mean, still, as you said, Paul, it was gritty. That defense, and, I mean, I think the Bears, and I'm biased, of course, have perhaps the best secondary in football. That defense did everything possible to make sure that the Bears could win that game. It was an ugly game, to say the least, but it was a good first victory. And the Bears have a lopsided schedule. Like they play all their division games after week 11, and this is probably the toughest division in the NFC North right now. And I think people sleeping on the Vikings too, because people may look at the Vikings as a cakewalk, but the Vikings had 7 victories like the Bears did last season. So anyway, it was a fun game. I hope when the Bears travel to Houston down south, that they can perhaps play better offensively because CJ Stroud is him. But we'll see. We have to see. This I think I may have had this marked as a loss when we did our too early predictions of the season. But we'll see what happens when they get down there. They have to run the ball better. And the Bears, I'll end it right there with this. I don't know how many people saw Hard Knocks, but if you saw Hard Knocks, you probably saw the Bears general manager and also their assistant general manager, Ryan Posen and Ian Cunningham, and they're both former offensive linemen. The only problem the Bears have had with that new regime, which has been a really, really good regime, they really haven't been able to solve the offensive line problems. And I think they're going to have to make some changes in how they identify players that they want to bring in moving forward. But they fixed so many things that you can't fix everything at once. But that's been a problem, and it'll be interesting looking forward if that offensive line can keep Caleb upright and he doesn't have to revert back to hero ball, which we saw him play at USC, particularly his last season at USC.
And the reason I asked you about that first is the first thing I wanted to ask you about is USC. Through 2 weeks, do you think this team is an actual contender for the Big Ten title now that they can actually stop people?
Yeah. Listen, D'Anton Lynn, anytime colleges make a change and you're like, man, you're really terrible on this side of the ball. And of course, we know with SC, the defensive side was where the last couple of years under Lincoln Riley, they had an issue. D'Anton Lynn has really showed that perhaps, and it's still early. I think we have to remember that with college football. It's still early, but the ability, one, to stop the opposing team's offense, and then you see on the offensive side that they have improved pass catching since, of course, Jordan Addison left for the Vikings the season before last. But defensively, yeah, to really get to your question, I think the thing is, one, who is Oregon? And Dan Lanning, because I think when we were thinking about Pac-12 schools coming into the Big Ten, I think there was no question that Oregon was going to be that rival to Ohio State. As of right now, I would have to say I probably still have Ohio State by itself now, since Oregon really hasn't shown that they're Oregon. But again, it's still early. But to get to your question on SC, yeah, they can definitely rival. I don't know if anybody has the talent that Ohio State has, but USC can definitely be that school in the Big Ten that's making noise. Because one thing that you have to remember with these Big Ten schools, and probably Ohio State will be the only one, you got to score with a team like SC. That's always the question when bringing these schools into the Big Ten is, listen, the Big Ten is big and burly, but these schools can put up points, and can you get to, let's say, said 35 points in order to keep up with a team like SC and an offensive mind like Lincoln Riley?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's talk about Oregon big picture. Boise State's really good, and I don't think Boise State, by the way, Pac-12 bound, Boise State is very, very good. They're taking one of those open seats that Oregon left and USC left in the Pac as they're on their way there in 2026 now. But how concerned are we about Oregon and finding out who they are? Or is this maybe just growing pains? Because, look, you lost a top 15 quarterback. You lost Bucky Irving, who there's an era in the NFL where Bucky Irving and guys like Bucky Irving, Jonathan Brooks, Trey Benson are all first-round picks. Now they're all picked later. But Bucky Irving is a guy who's already contributing to the Bucs. They lost Troy Franklin, one of the best wide receivers in that conference a year ago. And while they have replaced and reloaded, it's not completely the same when you lose guys who lead you to the cusp of what they led them to. Is this more just chemistry and finding out who these Ducks are as opposed to last year, or do they have real problems?
I think it's chemistry, but I think we're always going to talk about this whenever I join you with the Pac-12 schools coming into the Big Ten. The real question, and I think we thought Oregon with that Phil Knight money was going to be able to gear up. And you can see that Dan Lanning had been planning it already when it comes to the trenches. And when you talk about Boise State, and of course, like you mentioned, going to the Pac-12, and you just think about the opposing teams running the ball on Oregon. And that's an issue within the Big Ten. If you can't stop the run of an opposing team with these big corn-fed kids that you're going to be going up and opposing, you're going to have an issue. I think I have more hopes that this is growing pains than perhaps this is who Oregon is. Because as I said when we opened, I thought Oregon was really going to challenge Ohio State, but right now I don't see them being able to stop anybody. Dylan Gabriel has showed us that there's not going to be a dramatic drop off from Bo Nix from last season. And the last game, you didn't have as many pass attempts as he had the prior game when he was into the 40s. I think it was just into the 20s. But still, it's the question on the defensive side, but also running the ball to take possessions away from the opposing team. And I said on Big Ten Country that I would wait probably until next week before I really decide if I think this is who Oregon is. But right now, I don't look at Oregon as being mano a mano with the best team in the Big Ten, and that's Ohio State. I look at them as going through some real growing pains that I hope is not a trend moving forward, but it could be a trend if it continues to go forward, Paul.
Yeah, they should be able to. That's one of the interesting games this week is they are playing Oregon State. It is the Civil War.
Right.
Oregon State's been good so far early in the season. Looks like their defense is still as good as it was, even though Jonathan Smith is gone. They did retain a good chunk of that staff. I mean, they promoted from within, for the head coaching job. Obviously, Aiden Childs is gone, but he hasn't made waves up in Michigan in East Lansing yet. So, is this another game? I mean, this is a surprise. Look, Idaho, and I think people may not realize this, one of the better FCS teams, and they've got a coach on the rise there. Boise State might be the best group of 5 team when this thing is all said and done at the end of the year. They might wind up in the playoff. And then Oregon State is not only an in-state rival, but an in-state rival you left holding the bag for the conference that you didn't make any effort to help out at all other than saying, yeah, we'll continue this rivalry. And they're not bad. I mean, this is something that matters now. It's not November like this game used to be played in, which I wish it still was. If you're going to play it, play it in November. But this is still a big deal, and the Ducks have shown to be vulnerable.
It's whenever it's a rivalry game, it's hard to necessarily judge what's going to take place. So even with this, I am going to sit here and hold Oregon accountable. But still, when you're going up against Oregon State and what you just pointed out, what they can do defensively, but particularly also what they may be able to do on the offensive side, I'm going to wait because, again, these are anytime you can – it's like Duke and North Carolina in basketball. One of those teams can be trashed that season but can still go up and beat that other team that may be ranked in the top 3. It's similar, and I know Oregon is just ranked at number 9 right now, but Oregon State can win this game. I think Oregon needs to start sending a message, to be honest with you, Paul. They need to really start showing that there's a schism between them and not just these teams before they get to the conference, even as they get into the conference, to really start letting people know who Oregon is and reminding people who Oregon is. I do have Oregon winning. I don't know if I have them necessarily making the spread But yeah, Oregon has some questions. Dylan has some questions. I know he said they need to, button some things up and clean some things up, but it seems like it's a little bit more than that. But it's still pretty early in the season, and I don't want to come down with a hammer because sometimes teams don't start off the way that you expect, but by the end of the year, and look, I'm on here. I tell you all the time, roll tide, roll tide, roll tide.
Mm-hmm.
Look at Alabama last year. My co-host on Big Ten Country, James DeVoe, was getting on me and our producer Tony, who were Alabama fans at the beginning of last year. When they lost, and he was like, it's that early loss is the best loss. And we're not talking about Oregon losing now. I'm just talking about them going through bumps and bruises. So they can still be a team that can be contending, particularly when you're talking about a 12-team playoff. It can still be a team that can be contending, but I expect them to be a team that's dominating. And I think that's the real question as far as Oregon this season. Are you just in the group, or are you on top of the group as far as dominating everybody and let everybody know you're one of the best teams in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we'll stick with the Pac Big Ten remaining rivalries here with the Apple Cup. Wazoo just took it to Texas Tech, who, believe me, down here in this neck of the woods, if you wear red and black, you are hitting the panic button hard because they almost lost to Abilene Christian at home to open the season. If not for a failed 2-point conversion, they would have lost that game to ACU. Then they get on a plane and go to the Palouse and get trashed there. It just don't look very good at all. So not sure what that means for Washington State, but Washington State has a very dynamic quarterback who's not the best passer in the world, but it hasn't mattered yet.
Right.
And Washington is still in their transitional phase out of losing literally the entire roster and coaching staff from last year, which they would have lost the roster no matter what. Like that was going, even
right.
if Kalen DeBoer stays. I mean, they were all seniors and NFL guys who were going to get drafted. So that was happening no matter what. But now you have a situation where they're in a total rebuild. They haven't even gotten into the conference yet. This is another one kind of similar to Oregon and Wazoo, where there's blood money here on the line, so to speak.
Yes. I think the thing, and it's funny, we were talking about this yesterday on Big Ten Country. It's the style of play that Washington is going to want to go up against Washington State, because you just mentioned it as far as how dynamic their quarterback is. Like, do you want to sit there and not be yourself as far as scoring the football and give Washington State the chance to get back at you and score? Do you kind of want to play keep away in the fashion that Northern Illinois did with Notre Dame last week? And sometimes when you don't actually play to your strength and you try to do something different, you kind of set yourself up for failure. And I think that's the big question as far as what Jedd Fisch wants to do on the offensive side with Washington. What are you going to try to implement to slow down the offense of Washington State? Definitely, I'm still going to go with Washington, but again, with a rivalry game, you never know, and it's definitely going to be interesting how they try to slow down that offensive side of Washington State.
Yeah, I'm very curious about that one. All right, last week we talked at length about Nebraska and Colorado, and it came out, I think, pretty much even better, even more like we said it was going to. Now, I thought that there might be a couple of haymakers thrown by Colorado with that athletic talent where, things happen. Like, guys get loose. You've got speed. You've got talent, at those positions. But Nebraska absolutely physically dominated them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was like watching animals in the wild and just over. it was like lion v gazelle, and the gazelle didn't even have a chance. So it was just sitting there at the brook drinking water, and the lion just ate it right there. Long-term Nebraska, this team, given their schedule, I mean, I could easily see 8-4, 9-3, being something. And then if they get confident, who knows if they can steal a game and really kind of mess up the plan in the Big Ten.
So kind of what you're saying, is it a season too early from what we're usually used to with Matt Rhule? Usually you look at the jump to season 2 and then that jump to season 3. Are we at season 3 already as far as that bump in wins and losses, from losses? Listen, we talked about it last week. It was going to be Colorado's ass. I mean, and the funny thing about it was how it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about with Washington State, and about knowing who you are. So there were some instances in that game, before we just talk about the future of Nebraska moving forward this season, where you had the pick six, right? And you had Shedeur and the offense backed up. And listen, you and I are large men, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know in that if you're at goal line, your own goal line, basically, you just got to try to run the ball out and get maybe 5 yards so you have more room to punt that football, basically, right? Mm-hmm. And for them to sit there, and you knew they were going to do it, and to pass it out to the edges, and there's no motion, it's just sometimes it's kind of confusing what they're doing offensively. But then it's the flip side. They were down on the opposing teams on Nebraska's side near the goal line. They were in the red zone, and they tried to run the ball then, and it was like, you don't have offensive linemen that can do this, and you ended up being stopped. And it's one of those things where you got to know yourself. And I know as men, we always like to go mano a mano and show who we are. But you and I were talking prior to this show coming on about being in our 40s and kind of knowing who the hell we are.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
That's kind of what happened. Like, you looking at Colorado, forgetting that this isn't your strength. And unfortunately, you haven't brought in the young men that can make this and fortify your offensive line and defensive line, because they need some hogs in the middle of that defense. They need some run stuffers in the middle of that defense. But that was the issue why I was all Nebraska last week. Now, moving forward, as far as Nebraska, it's kind of, I don't want to say how far Dylan Raiola can take you, because we saw a little bit of the petulance where he wanted to go for it on fourth down.
Yeah.
And Matt Rhule was like, calm it down now. Calm it down a little bit. And I was talking about on the show how I remember 4 years ago, and first of all, of course, I love Patrick Mahomes. I labeled him Baby Goat. EA didn't pay me when they had him and Tom Brady. He had the little goat, but they stole that from me, just so everybody knows. That was a slick way to get it over, EA. That was a slick way. But the point being, I remember when Patrick Mahomes was still kind of petulant early in his NFL career, about the third season, and him doing that to Andy Reid, and Andy Reid telling him the same, and looking at Dylan Raiola in college having those actions. I mean, he's shown what he can do. I don't know if we can put that much on him, though, as far as there's going to be some bumps this year, and there's probably going to be some turnovers, and that's actually okay, because for me, again, if they're a year ahead of schedule, great. Next year is really that year, and then perhaps his third season there, because we're also talking about the type of light you're going to be shining on the program, having one of the best quarterbacks in the country playing there, and who's going to want to come play for him, of course, on the offensive side, but also some defenders that want to come up there. But I'm with you. They can definitely get 8 wins this year. I think the real thing is, and it's credit to one, Matt Rhule, for allowing Dylan Raiola to do it. It's just not traditional Nebraska football, basically. When you're talking about, we're big enough, we can run on you, we can do whatever, but listen, I can go over the top on you with the quarterback like that, and that kind of throws everything into flux in a positive way for Nebraska, because it seems like they kind of have the traditional style of the trenches, and I'm always going to be big on the trenches, but it seems like they have the traditional trenches, but now you kind of have this freakish pro-style young freshman quarterback who may be able to keep you in games that in the past you weren't going to be able to keep staying games in the Tom Osborne run the option, even though I know that was a super option back in the 90s with the amount of talent that Tom Osborne used to bring to Nebraska.
Looking at Matt Rhule's career, I think the reason you can maybe accelerate it in Nebraska is this is now when he came into Baylor, they were at their peak of caring, except for the fact that they had the scandal and the fans had been just kind of beaten down over a year of, everything we always wanted, we finally had, and then it was just taken away. And so it was a very weird emotional transition for the fans, many of whom just, no matter what Matt Rhule did, which included building a team that eventually won the Big 12, taking a team to the Sugar Bowl that lost to Georgia the year before Georgia became Georgia, all of that, like he took them to those places, to the Big 12 title game, all these things. Like there's a group that was never going to really support him because they were mad about Art Briles. And, Temple doesn't care about anything. So him winning there was, all of a sudden they care, right? And then he's at the Panthers where there's a fan base there, but he's got a crazy owner. So this is the first place that he's actually walked into where, no, they care more than you. Like this is this is kind of that ultimate maybe Ted Lasso situation where you've got a fan base that's been kind of dumped on for a while that cared because they used to be really, really great. And now you've kind of intersected into the place where your enthusiasm and work ethic can finally intersect with people that care. He was down here, Smokey and I had dinner with him one day, and he's like, the coaches, like when they got hired, they get to the airport and they're like, "Oh, you're the new wide receivers coach." And they're like, "Well, everywhere else I could walk around in anonymity and people would go, 'Oh, he's the wide. Oh, that's neat. Take a picture for me.'" But that would be like one thing,
Yeah.
And now everywhere they go, like the guy's renting a car and it's like, "Hey, are we getting some good wide receivers?" Like, how did you know this? I just landed here and I'm handing you, the rental car slip. That's all it is. So it's different when you get to a place that breeds football like Nebraska does.
One, you have some of the students staying an extra year because they want to have the option to get into a bowl game.
Yeah.
But I think you hit it on the head. And I think for anybody that's perhaps in their later 20s or early 30s, you don't know Nebraska. Like Nebraska, I think majority of the sleeping giants in college football have been rewoken in the last 20 years. And I'm talking about like Notre Dame has been good, so it's been to a level that I don't know if a lot of us thought they can maintain under Kelly. You look at the fact that SC has had Pete Carroll and now perhaps what Lincoln Riley can do. I'm an Alabama fan. Nick Saban is an outlier. Nobody should be able to do that. That was great in the run. But you look at Miami, you look at Texas and what Sarkisian is doing down there. Point being that most of the schools that even way before you and I roamed this planet, and we're talking about barnstorming in the NFL, and when college was owned every football, that was the real football. We've kind of seen in our lifetime those teams, Nebraska being one of those last teams that when we're talking about getting to the aughts, but the mid 90s, and they were a college football hotbed. Like Nebraska, Tom Osborne, it was crazy what they were doing in Nebraska in the 90s or whatever. And I never believed, to your point, that this giant could be reawoken. And there's still levels to it, and there's still levels to see what they have the person. I will say that with Matt Rhule, they have the right person to resuscitate it. And you even look at the way that he's doing it by getting into the high schools. And of course, he'll be able to use NIL and transfer portal. But the thing that I think some of the problem with the transfer portal is build your base and then use the portal as much instead of using the portal to build your base. Because the thing that when you and I were younger with the school like Nebraska, well, when we were younger, Nebraska could get athletes up there. You look at Tommy Frazier, you look at Lawrence Phillips, like they could get kids to come to cold. They
weren't from the Midwest. Tommy Frazier's from Bradenton, Florida.
That's the thing that Nebraska hasn't been able to do that, and that will, one, because of Matt Rhule and Dylan Raiola, that'll just happen. But the transfer portal will allow you to, one, we can get our offensive linemen from up here. We can fortify the trenches, we can fortify the line. But okay, let's just say we will need said receiver. Now it allows them, and Matt Rhule will be able to do that. I think it could be really freaky what Matt Rhule may be able to pull off at Nebraska. And I think it's to your point, it's one of the best places, one, to be a college football coach, a student or player. And if they can do it, it'll be a legacy, really, if Matt Rhule is able to pull it off. And I'll say this too, getting back to him with the Panthers, the best part about it is he's already tasted the NFL, because I think that's one of those things where you're a college coach and you always have that questions. And I mentioned like the Duke and North Carolina rivalry. And I can remember always at times thinking when we were younger, man, is Coach K going to go to the pros? And there's always that fear. But Matt Rhule has gotten that out of his blood to a degree. Not to say he may not try it again, but he kind of knows how.
I can tell you, right at this point right now, I don't think he has any desire to go back.
Because you know where your bread is buttered. Yeah. So and now if you can own Nebraska, what's the point of going back and letting some owner dilly-dally with what the hell you want to do? It's the same thing where at Alabama, where people were at times fearful would Nick Saban leave for a place like Texas and the amount of money Texas has. But it was kind of like apples to apples, because he resuscitated Bama. Nobody thought they were going to be better than Bear Bryant's Alabama.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, why am I going to leave here to go there when basically what I did here is as big as if I do it there? And that's what Matt Rhule could do if he can get Nebraska back to the levels that Tom Osborne, or even further than what Tom Osborne had it back in the 90s.
Yeah, I don't know this for a fact, but Matt Rhule is friends with everybody. I bet you he did probably talk to Saban like when he was coming back in, because I think his initial thought was, I'm going to sit out for a year, and then Nebraska came in and was like, hey, don't do that. Right. And so I'm almost betting that he probably would have, because he's one of those guys who will, investigate every opportunity to the best of his ability. All right, two more things we got to talk about. We'll close with your Bama Tide and the Badgers up at Camp Randall, but can Michigan be fixed?
Yeah, Michigan be fixed. Yeah. I mean, everything that you kind of said about Oregon, no, Washington. Yeah, everything you said about Washington, we got to apply that to Michigan.
Yeah.
Let's stop. Their head coach, who finally figured it out, went back to where we knew he was going to go, eventually to the pros. I'm a Bears fan. We drafted him here as our quarterback. He's basically was in my era of being a young Bears fan.
Yeah.
Speaking of Jim Harbaugh, all right. You lost your coaches and coordinators. You lost 12 of your top players, basically. All right. Of course, they weren't going to be the same team. And I think the real thing, and it's funny, just mentioning transfer portal, was they didn't go out and get a quarterback, and that's kind of perhaps the issue, but still they got to regrow these players that are still there and coming through the pipeline, and that may take a season. Sherrone Moore just signed his contract, played 2 games or coached 2 games without a contract signed. I think Michigan will be okay. I think the real question is, was the last couple of years more of an outlier, or was it closer to what we can expect? If anybody knows, the academic standards to get into Michigan are somewhat difficult. So to be able to win a national title in Michigan is something different. But I do think Sherrone Moore will be able to get them close. I don't know as of right now if they'll be exactly the team. But one thing we have to focus on, he was one, if not their lead recruiter. So it's not like that. You at least kept that going for you as far as the person that was bringing in most of the studs that you're bringing in. Also, he was, of course, a really good offensive line coach. And we know that, one, we need to see this offensive line improve in Michigan, but at least you have the blood as far as the person that was putting it together. So I don't know if this year, I think this is still a growing year for Michigan, but I do think in the coming seasons, Michigan will be a threat within the Big Ten. And the key thing is, all they have to do is be Michigan. That's, I think, what Jim Harbaugh learned was, I don't have to go out here and try to play Ryan Day's game. I can beat you up and bully you. And that's the thing that Michigan needs to do. Get your offensive line and your defensive line squared up, run the ball and play action the hell out of those other teams, and you'll be fine. And as long as they can keep that recruiting base, I think Michigan will be fine. But we still kind of have to wait and see. Because you're still talking about someone who hasn't been a head coach in the Big Ten. And we know he had times where he coached last year, but this is his program now. And Michigan fan base asks a lot. They are spoiled. They're a child that's spoiled, who really, it's like, why are you spoiled? You haven't had this in all these years, but they still act extremely spoiled. And it's like, you're too poor to act extremely spoiled like that. But that's Michigan, and they pay a hefty price to attend that school. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Bama and Wisconsin. Bama's 16-point favorites coming off what was a penalty-ridden game against South Florida, where they finally got their sea legs late in the game. But it was, I remember I flipped over to the game and I'd missed probably about a quarter and a half. And it had that feeling in Tuscaloosa where everybody's like, I really, like, they couldn't leave their seat because they're like, if I leave, it's all going to fall apart. Like, if I'm holding it together with my will. And that ultimately turned out not to be a problem. But Alex Golish's face when he shook hands was, he looked like he felt like he let one get away. Like he had it and he let one get away. Is this just, this is growing pains for Alabama, obviously. But they have a new coach and a bunch of new stuff too. But is 16.5 too big of a spread? Tyler Van Dyke's the quarterback on the other side. So I think it's probably about right.
I'm with you. I I think this is the thing. First of all, I love the Badgers. Growing up here in Illinois, Barry Alvarez was one of my favorite college coaches. And I know it's funny, we were talking to a reporter up there yesterday, and I was asking about, the ruggedness of the offensive line, because that's one of the places where, Wisconsin always stood out and being able to impugn their physicality on teams. I think 16 and 16 and a half is fine, because I think you got another year with Jalen Milroe. I talked to Jalen Milroe last year, a great young man. We know what he can do with his legs, but we also know what he can do with his arm. And then you look at how great those running backs are. And what I think is probably going to end up happening, I think Wisconsin will be able to slow them down initially. But, Paul, I think they're going to get gashed by the running game. And then I think once the running game starts gashing them, the play action pass is going to start obliterating them. So I think it's kind of similar to this last game, where, if you look at the score, you don't see the context that you was pointing out as far as Alabama. That was a rough game for Alabama. But if you just look at the score, you wouldn't expect it was a rough game. I think this game will be easier for Alabama, but I still think the first half may be somewhat rugged. But I think it'll be a war of attrition, and just the talent depth that Alabama has is going to bludgeon Wisconsin on the offensive side of the football, and even on the defensive side of the football, but particularly on the offensive side of the football. So I would probably take the spread. I would take the spread if I was putting my money on it.
Kenneth Davis, Big Ten Country. Kenneth, thank you so much. Enjoy your football weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.
Appreciate you. You guys have a good one.
That's Kenneth Davis, Big Ten Country. This is 365 Sports.